Thank you for being with us tonight, and it's good to see all of you. You can take out your Bibles and turn to Mark 7, but I'm also going to put the passage on the screen. We'll be looking at the first 22 verses of this little section. What's interesting in Mark 7, and many of you, especially on Sunday night, you know what's in Mark 7. The Pharisees come up and they make an accusation of Jesus and the apostles. And even though it seems like at first it's just a story about the Pharisees complaining again about something Jesus did, what it actually ends up being is Jesus explaining to you and me one of the cornerstones of our faith and one of the cornerstones of our understanding of what Christianity really is. And one of those cornerstones is learning how to distinguish between what came from man and what came from God. And learning that there's a line there and that there's a difference. And for all time, since people have been practicing Christianity, we've had these conversations. Well, did we learn this from God or did we learn this from men? And where do we get that from? Well, that cornerstone all boils back to Mark chapter 7 or Matthew chapter 15 or any other place it's recorded, right? That Jesus would teach us that we have a problem of teaching doctrines, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So let's read those first 22 verses. And then we'll have some application after that. The chapter begins in Mark 7 like this. It says, "Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they're washed their hands in a special way, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. And the Pharisees and scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?' He answered and said to them, 'Well, did Isaiah the prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, with their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do.' He said to them, 'All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or for his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have handed down, and many such things you do.' When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, 'Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which he cannot defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear.' When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, 'Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from the outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods.' And he said, 'What comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed all evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile a man.'" That's a little bit of a longer reading there, but let's go back and we'll start from the beginning. I know this is really cool. PowerPoint updated, and I'm having a ball with it. The first thought that Mark gives us here is he gives us, our Gentile audience, an explanation of the way that the Jews lived. And the first paragraph there is the Pharisees explaining the traditions that they had certain ways of washing certain different vessels. And from what we understand historically is that there was a blessing that was supposed to be done with it. You would wash your cup this way, you wash your hands this way, and you'd say this blessing while you washed your hands. A lot of these traditions not coming from Moses, not coming from the prophets, but coming from that period of silence when the Jews were trying to keep their identity after being invaded by the Greeks. And it seems to be this is one of these traditions that the Jews passed down. Is Jesus here saying you shouldn't wash your hands? No, kids. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about a tradition, right, or a special blessing to do. Well, then we get to verse 5. The Pharisees and the scribes come out with this accusation. They see Jesus and the apostles not doing the special way of washing their hands before they eat. And they come up to him, they're like, why, Jesus, do your disciples not wash your hands according to the tradition of the elders? But they're just sitting down and eating. And let me just say it again for the second time. They're not coming up and saying, wow, y'all didn't wash your hands before you eat. That's not what's being said. What's being said is, why haven't you kept the tradition of the elders? Why haven't you done the special thing that we all Jews do? And then this is Jesus' answer, and he snaps back pretty hard, which makes me always wonder that Jesus, it's like he was sitting on this thought and he was just waiting for the opportunity to share it. And now they've given him an opportunity to share it, and he's going to share it hard. Well, he quotes Isaiah, and especially here in verse 7, he says, no, in vain you worship God, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And there's the problem, that you've got a commandment of men, you've got a tradition of man, you've got an idea for man, but what are you treating it like? You're treating it like it came from God. You're treating it like it's scripture. You're treating it like it came from the prophets. But it didn't come from the prophets. And there's the issue. Verse 8, then, he begins to give the example. And again, this gives me the reason that Jesus has been thinking about this for a while, because this example of the way they do this wrong is very specific. Verse 8, for laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men. So it's not just that the Pharisees are honoring this tradition as if it's from God, but they have gone as far as to getting their tradition and elevating it as more important than the true commandments of God. And then we get to verse 9, verse 10, he's specific. He says, you know, one of the commandments from Moses is honor your father and mother. You know that. And that's a commandment that was obviously given from God on Mount Sinai. And we can go to other places like 1 Timothy 5, and we can make the point that it's implied that honor your father and mother means financially taking care of your mother and your father if they need help, right? Your mother and your father, they kept you alive when you were a baby, so it's appropriate and fitting that you would make sure to keep them alive when they're older and may not be able to work and take care of themselves. So that's obviously what honor your father means. But what these people have done is they have began to take financial goods that could have been given to their mother and father, but instead declared Corban on them. And he says that is a gift of God. Corban here is a Jewish word that we don't use in any other setting except for when we're talking about this passage. But Corban is not Corban register, right? That's with a K. This is C. The concept is that this is something that you could have in your house, maybe a special item, and you were able to keep that item, but you would tell people that this is Corban, meaning that if the temple is ever in disarray, if the priests have gone bankrupt, I will sell this item and I will go and I will give it to the proceeds to the temple. And on just a paper surface, that looks like a very nice thing to do, right? But the problem is that there were people whose parents were in need, and they could have sold their silverware and give the proceeds to their parents, but instead they declared them Corban. So we're going to go ahead and keep the silverware, right? And my parents will just go without, but it's okay because we declared Corban. What's the issue here? The issue is God did tell them to honor their father and mother, but God didn't tell them anything about declaring things as gifts to God, right? And you even think about it on a deeper level. What's the concept of Corban? Really, the concept of Corban is I'm going to have these nice things, and I'm going to get to keep these nice things because I have declared them as belonging to God. But when are you actually ever going to sell that thing and give it to the temple? You're never actually going to sell it and give it to the temple. It's really dirty at the core. But Jesus brings it up, right? You've replaced the commandment of God with your own personal tradition. When he gets with the disciples later, he brings them together and gives us that cornerstone, which is, it's not the things that go in the stomach that defile a man, it's the things that come out of the heart. And he lists these things off in verse 21, evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, right? All the way down to foolishness. The thought I think that Jesus is bringing out of this for face value for us tonight is he's saying, look, I'm not interested in the things that y'all came up with that's important. What I'm interested in is the things that God told you was important. And God never said anything to you about how to wash your hands in a special way. But he did tell you to stay away from these evil, sinful things. But you don't care about those. You're not considering those things. You're considering what man has taught. And there's where your heart's wrong. And so this is this cornerstone that we're given here in Mark chapter 7. Now, as is the tradition of the elders, every time anyone teaches Mark 7, they have to give this example where we tell on ourselves for making this mistake. And you know what it's about? Many of you know what the example is I'm about to use. It's about the veil that we used to use to cover up the Lord's Supper elements. And every time I've ever heard anyone teach Mark 7, they immediately go to this example where we get to tell on ourselves. So let's not break the tradition of the elders. I'm going to give the example. The example is, maybe for you youngins that haven't heard it, is that there was a time in this world where church buildings didn't have air conditioning. And I know that sounds like a miserable world to live in, but they didn't have air conditioning. Nobody had air conditioning. So what did you do in the warm summer months when you didn't have air conditioning? Well, church buildings were built with windows, right? Windows that actually opened. And so you would open all your windows, right? And the church building, you come in and someone had opened up all the windows. Well, when you have windows open and you have food out, even if it's something like the elements of the Lord's Supper, what also likes to eat the elements of the Lord's Supper? The bugs do, right? The flies would come in and they would huddle up on your Lord's Supper table because that's where you had unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. So what was the easy solution? Was what everybody did when they had food out outside back then. You get a blanket or a tablecloth or something of that nature and you would cover the food. And then whoever was heading the table, they would come up there and they would remove the tablecloth or the blanket, whatever it is, and then they would offer the Lord's Supper, right? That's the way it was done. Well, jump years into the future and air conditioning now exists. And air conditioning units are being put into church buildings and windows are staying closed. Well, what do we still have on the Lord's Supper table? We're still putting that tablecloth or that veil, what we began to call it, on top of the elements. And then someone suggests, maybe we don't have to put the cloth out. And what do us Christians do? We begin to freak out. My whole life, we've had a cloth on top of the elements. And now we're getting rid of it? People even made arguments that the cloth represented the veil that was torn. And when the guy who goes and he removes the veil before they take the supper, they were saying that symbolized the veil being torn in the temple when Jesus died. So now we've tried to attribute it to something that God did tell us. And we have to worry about it. We have to figure it out, right? Well, what's the issue? The issue is we had a tradition. And the moment when the tradition was no longer necessary, we had to actually figure out, back to Mark 7, did this thing come from man or did this thing come from God? And what conclusion did we come to? Well, that thing came from man. It didn't come from God, and we don't need to cover up the elements when the windows are closed, right? And I imagine if we got a lot of brethren from that generation here today, they would definitely be worried and freaking out about what we're doing now. But, again, you got to go back. What are the things that were given to us by God? What are things that are non-negotiable? What are things that we're using just to keep the commandments of God? And there's an example in history, in our own history, when Mark 7 was very important. So now that we've covered this reading, let's again just continue to make application. And I want to use two biblical examples of Mark 7 and just try to use two real-world examples of Mark 7, and the lesson will be yours. The first one is in Jeremiah, and you could be turning to Jeremiah chapter 41. with me? The way Isaiah phrases it is he says, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. The way that my brain says it is treating the practices of men as if they're gods. And I think maybe that's what we would phrase it if we would need to say it today. So that's what I'm going to keep on saying from here on out. The problem is treating the practices of men as if they are gods. And that's the ASV, right? The Andrew Smith version. Jeremiah 41, where we're sitting here is the temple has been destroyed. Zedekiah's sons have been killed, his eyes have been plucked out, and he's been dragged off to Babylon. Gedaliah has been made governor of what's left of Israel. And now that the temple's destroyed, we have a governor in place, the king's been taken away. There's this evil man named Ishmael that comes in, and he takes advantage of their situation, and he murders Gedaliah. Ishmael, up to no good, finds some men that have traveled from Shechem to weep and mourn for the destroyed temple, for the destroyed house of the Lord. And Ishmael's going to murder them. All I want to do is pull out of this, though, is the description of what the men from Shechem have done to show their respect and show that they're in mourning for the house of the Lord. Look here, starting in verse 3, chapter 41. It says, Ishmael also struck down all the Jews who were with him, that is, with Gedaliah and Mizpah, and the Chaldeans who were found there, the men of war. And it happened on the second day after he had killed Gedaliah, when he had yet no one knew it, that certain men came from Shechem, from Shiloh, and from Samaria, 80 men with their beards shaved and their clothes torn, having cut themselves with offerings and incense in their hand to bring them to the house of the Lord. So here's 80 men from Shechem, and they're in mourning that the temple's been destroyed, right? For obvious reasons. They come bringing incense and offerings, right? Do these men not have the best intentions? I think they have the best intentions you can have. I mean, they care about what is God's. They care about the Lord. They've showed up to show their respect to this awful thing that's happened to the house of the Lord. But how do they show their respect to the Lord? Well, it says that they shave their beards and they tear their clothes, which are things we see in other places in God's word. But what have they also done? They have cut themselves. Are these good men? I would say yes, they are good men. Are these men who care about God? Yes, these are men who care about God. But what have they done to show God that they care? They've cut themselves. Now, where did that tradition come from? Did that come from men or did that come from God? Well, that tradition came from men, didn't it? So here we have people cutting themselves, treating this practice of men as if it's from God. Let's turn to 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings 18. This is the story of Elijah challenging the Baal prophets to the sacrifice contest on Mount Carmel. And we get a little nudge there of where this cutting yourself practice came from. In 1 Kings 18, let's start in verse 26. It says, so they took the bull which was given to them and they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning even till noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, no one answered. Then they leapt about the altar which they had made. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is meditating, or as he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances until the blood gushed out on them. If you don't know the story, the Baal prophets, they lose. And Elijah and the Lord win, right? But right there, here at the very beginning of this story, where did these men several hundred years later get it in their mind that they should cut themselves to honor God. They got it from the Baal prophets. That's exactly where they got it. It was their custom, right? And if you read Jeremiah, what's the issue in Jeremiah? The issue is Baal. The people are more concerned about Baal than they're concerned about the Lord. And now you've got good men with the best intentions, but they've taken some of the things of Baal, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and they believe it has something to do with their God. What have we done? We've accidentally brought paganism into the true belief system of God. That's what we've accidentally done, and we weren't able to draw that line of where the practices of men begin and end and where the practices of God begin and end, and we've made a mistake, right? That's fascinating to me. It's a scary thing, but it's fascinating to think that paganism can creep into what we do and we don't even know it. That's kind of scary, right? What would be other examples of this? And it's something I've been trying to think about this week. What are examples of maybe Christians trying to bring in paganism and not even know they're bringing in paganism and trying to attribute those things to God when really they're from Baal? The first thing that I thought of, and many of you know about this, that in the 8th and 9th century, people and Christians began making icons. And what I mean by Christian icons is in the 8th and 9th centuries, they begin building statues to saints and to other biblical figures, and the statues themselves become important, right? So it's not like I make a statue of Peter because I think it's going to be a good visual aid in my sermon. That's not the concept. The concept is I made a statue of Peter because I think it's going to be important, and it's going to become a Christian icon, and I'm going to be able to sell it and trade it. I'm going to be able to sell it to people as if it's going to protect their homes because they have this icon of Peter. In Istanbul or Constantinople in the 8th century, the Muslims are coming in and they're invading the city. And what do the Christians do? They're standing at the gates with their little statues of their saints as if they're going to save them, right? Well, what do Christians or other Christians begin doing at this sort of thing? And the fancy word is iconoclasm, and you don't need to know that. But people begin to become anti-Christian icon. Don't make images. Don't make these icons. Don't worship them. Don't buy them. Don't sell them. Even though we call them Christian and even though they're about biblical figures, we don't need to have a part of them. Why do Christians begin to be anti-icons? What's the concept? The concept is we didn't get graven images from God. Where did we get graven images from? We got it from the pagans. And what we've tried to do with probably the best intentions, we've gotten the things we liked about paganism and we tried to make it Christian. And now we think, oh, this is something that's of Jehovah. This is something of Jesus. This is something good. But at the end of the day, where did it originate? It originated with the pagans, right? What have we done? We're teaching the practices of men as if they're gods. And the Muslims come and wipe us out. We wonder why the icons didn't come and help us. Well, just be the same way the pagan gods didn't come and help you either, did they? Could this be our problems today, though? And don't get me wrong, I know that we're not having an issue with y'all trying to go out and making statues. But can we accidentally, with the best intentions, bring in a practice of man and think it's something good and it's going to be, this is going to help God, right? Bear with me if you think this is absurd. But, a lot of us, we get together and we talk about what are things Gardendale can be doing to be better in terms of edification, to be better in terms of evangelism. We have these conversations, and I'm glad we have those conversations. We need to talk about things like that. What are some things we could be doing, right? What if a brother or a sister with the best intentions suggests that we have a Christmas play? And I know some of us think that's funny, but just hold on to it for just a second. What if a brother or sister suggested that? Let's have a Christmas play. And they can make all the best arguments in the world logically with our own wisdom. Well, a lot of us grew up at churches where we had Christmas plays, and we have good memories of those things. Maybe that'll make people feel more welcome if we try to do something like that. We could argue that it would be a good evangelistic opportunity, and we would say, well, people would come from all over the neighborhood to come watch our Christmas play, and we would have opportunities to pick up studies, and we could have this great evangelistic effort. We could make all of those man-logical wisdom arguments, couldn't we? But how do we have to end that conversation? Well, where did we learn to do Christmas plays? Did that come from God or did that come from men? Right? Well, obviously, that's something that came from men. That's just us trying to copy what the big denominations are doing. And that's really what the big denominations were trying to copy what the Catholic Church was doing. And ultimately, that's really what the Catholic Church was doing, to try to copy paganism, right? So where did that thing originate from? It's not from God. So why are we trying to have a conversation about whether we should do it or not, right? And again, with the best intentions, no evil intentions, but maybe we've just allowed man to sneak into the church a few times. And here's one more example. What about if we say, well, we've got like 30 kids under 3, and they're very loud. Wouldn't it be easier on our moms if we would just get all the under 3-year-olds and we would take them to another room during church, and we would have like a children's church out there? And we could then begin to argue about all the logical reasons why that would be a good thing. We would say, well, it would give a lot of the mothers here a better opportunity to actually pay attention in services. Because let's face it, as a parent, we don't really get to pay attention in services all the time. Sometimes we're wrestling, right? Well, this would be a great opportunity to give parents a chance to pay attention in services a little bit better. We could ask some sisters to take turns going back there and watching the kids, and they could be back there and be quiet while we're just getting to worship church, worship the Lord together, and that would be a good thing. And that would be some logical argument we would come up with. Now, somebody who didn't want it, they could make a logical argument back. They could go, okay, I understand why we want to do that, but at what point do we integrate the kids back? At what point are they going to learn that they do have to sit through church? What point are they going to learn that this is important and they need to sit down and be quiet to the best of their ability? And you can't argue with a 2-year-old about being quiet to the best of her ability. I'm not trying to argue like we can. But eventually, as we get older, we learn, okay, well, we're at church, we got to be quiet. Well, if we keep them back there, when do they learn? Well, while we're having this big logical argument about which way's better, what do we need to do a long time ago? Why do we want to have children's church? Did we learn that from man or did we learn that from God? We learned that from the big denominations down the street. That's where that came from, right? Did God teach us that? Did God say you need to separate the assembly? Did God say you need to send your kids somewhere else when you come to the assembly of the saints? We didn't learn that from God. So why are we having a conversation about it? I think, again, with the best intentions, we've accidentally allowed man's doctrine to slip in as if it's from God, as if it's helpful. And again, it's just things we need to have conversations about. And I think that question needs to begin. What about clapping after a speaker? And now, this isn't something that's pagan. This is just something that man has been doing since we've had hands. I guess Adam and Eve, realized they both had hands and they realized they could smack them together. Oh, that makes a sound. We've been clapping for thousands of years for everything. In the Old Testament, there's several times in the Old Testament it mentions that they were clapping. They were clapping when they got a new king. They smacked their hands together. Sometimes, though, they're clapped for very wicked things. And the prophets bring up how, I know you're clapping. You're clapping because this wicked thing has been accomplished. Well, if we begin clapping after a sermon's over, and if you feel like you need to clap for me, you could just do it in the parking lot. But if we just feel like, we do this at school, we do this at work, why not just go ahead and do it as a church practice too? We can start arguing about the logic about which would be better. But at the end of the day, again, Where did we get that tradition from? Did we get it from God or did we get it from man? Well, we got it from man, didn't we? Because even in the New Testament, there's not a single mention from the apostles of clapping for anything, right? Now, what did the Christians do in the New Testament when they were joyful about something? They didn't clap. What did they do? They sang, right? Like in James 5. We get examples in 1 Corinthians 14 that when the visitor is in agreement, he can say, amen, right? Those are practices that we learn from God. But would we replace those practices we learn from God with something that's earthly? I don't know why we would have that conversation. You would think we would just want to always stay satisfied with the traditions that God has left us. Let's use another biblical example. Let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1, here at the very beginning of the book, Paul has to correct the men in Ephesus and the teachers in Ephesus for becoming obsessed about teaching one thing instead of just teaching the doctrine that they've received from God. Verse 3 of 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul says, as I've urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which cause disputes rather than a godly edification which is in faith. Verse 3, the end there. He says, Timothy, stay in Ephesus and charge the others not to teach any other doctrine but the doctrine that God gave you, right? The doctrine of the apostles. Because they want to give heed, verse 4, to other things than the doctrine of God. They want to give heed to fables and endless genealogies. And what does Paul say about those things? They cause disputes and they do not cause godly edification in faith. And the purposes of being us together is for edification, to build one another up and towards the Godhead. But these things don't cause edification, they just cause disputes. The genealogies thing, I've always found kind of funny. That several times Paul mentions it in Timothy and Titus, that it was an issue that these teachers wanted to get up and explain to everybody what their genealogy was, what their family history was. That, maybe a Jewish Christian would want to get up and explain to the congregation how he knew how he was related to the patriarch Simeon. And he would want to get up there and we would all have to sit and listen to him rant and rave about my daddy bore this daddy and my daddy bore this daddy. And by the way, that was Simeon, the guy you read about in your Bible. Like that was going to be somehow edifying to the body. And I've always thought that was really strange to think that that would even be a possibility in the first century church, that anyone would dare to do that. But the longer I've been a Christian, and the longer I've sat through many, many Wednesday night exhortations, I can totally believe that there would be a brother that would try that. I could totally believe it. That you would have a brother Bubba would get up there and just try to tell us his genealogy, how it gets back to Simeon. Like that was going to be somehow helpful. And we're supposed to leave and be like, thank you, brother Bubba, for the exhortation. We've gotten in trouble doing things like that. Not necessarily genealogies, but you can have a Bible teacher that has the opportunity to speak. You can have a Bible teacher that has been given the opportunity since we have all come together to be edified and to spend time talking about something that has nothing to do with anything. That's not useful edification, is it? That's a practice of men. That's not what we've received from God. That's not the doctrine. What about the fables? There's a different ways you can go with the word fables. I think it's a possibility that the Greeks here, in Ephesus, were trying to use their teaching opportunities to teach Greek philosophy. And a lot of Greek philosophy is fables. And we know them mostly from like Aesop's fables, right? We know about the tortoise and the hare. And the little story about how the turtle beat the hare because he was slow and steady and he kept on going, but the rabbit fell asleep. We've learned that story, right? Or the lion and the mouse. and the mouse comes and he takes the thorn out of the lion's paw, right? And then later the lion's able to save the mouse. These are fine stories in themselves. But do you think there's an issue with maybe brothers trying to get up and teaching opportunities about God? We've come together to be edified, and they're spending their time telling stories that they've learned when they were a little kid from Aesop's fables instead of trying to teach the doctrine of God. I remember being a little kid, and we had a meeting with Bob Waldron. And if you want to talk about good storytellers, there's one right there. I mean, he can tell a story about anything. I pay attention. But I remembered him complaining about how a family invited him over to the house, and they said, hey, we want to show you this cartoon that does the Bible stories. We think they're really good. Will you watch one with us? And Bob's like, yeah, sure. So they sit down and they watch a movie that's supposed to be about Daniel in the lion's den, which is, Daniel chapter 6. And what Bob was so frustrated about in the movie is that it didn't tell the story of Daniel in the lion's den. It didn't tell the story about Daniel's faithfulness to God and how the angel came to shut the mouths of the lions. It didn't tell that story. You know what the story it told? It told a story about Daniel finding a lion with a thorn in his paw. And then Daniel came and he helped save the lion from the thorn of his paw. And then that lion happened to be the lion in the lion's den. And then that lion protected Daniel from all the other lions. And I was a little kid, but I remember Mr. Bob being furious. Because what have you done? Here's one of God's stories. Let's throw that away. Here's one of our stories. Let's tell that one instead, right? That's an Aesop fable. What's the issue? That's not edification, right? I think it's okay to tell stories sometimes, but unless the story explains a passage or it explains how we're disobeying a passage, we have no reason to be telling those stories. The contemporary translation here for fables changes the word to senseless stories. And I have heard senseless stories in the Bible classroom, and you have too. Do those edify? No, they don't. That's from man. But I'm only interested in what's from God, right? And I think, again, that's Mark 7, the idea that keeps us different. Let's finish out this passage. Look at verse 5. Now, this is the purpose of the commandment, is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith, from which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither of what they say nor the things which they affirm. We may all desire to teach, and certainly we should all at least be desirous to be teachers of our dining room tables. But if you're going to teach, what do you got to do? You got to know God's doctrine. And if you're telling fables and genealogies, the reason why you're doing that is because you don't know God's doctrine, right? We've had meetings before where I can remember the stories that were told in those meetings, but I have no earthly idea what those meetings were about. Now, there's other times where I can remember meetings, and I can sometimes remember the stories, but I really remember what the meeting was about and what the message of the gospel was. And you know what one of those meetings were? One of those good meetings was when I was a little bitty kid and I heard Bob Waldron teach, and I still can remember it. Now, did he use stories? Yeah, he did, but I remember the message. Versus having a meeting where we hear lots and lots of good stories, but we have no earthly idea what the message is. What are we longing for? Well, hopefully we're longing for God's doctrine. And of course, that's from a preacher perspective, but certainly we can apply that perspective to any of these things. And all I ask is that when we do have conversations about what we should do, where should we move from here, that we would ask this question. Are we treating the practices of men as if they're God's, or are we treating God's doctrine like it is God's doctrine? Thank you for your close attention. If there's anyone here tonight that understands God's doctrine, the concept of God's doctrine is that these are the teachings of Jesus that are good. These are the teachings of Jesus that can save your soul. We want to assist you to become part of that process of God's doctrine tonight. If there's anyone that we can spiritually assist, why don't you come forward as we stand and as we sing.